You're just not that interesting. Except, of course, when you are. Hi, everyone. Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Privacy is one of those issues that comes up repeatedly when it comes to computing, particularly now that so much is happening online. There's so many opportunities for the information that we care about to be exposed to, well, people we might not want to have it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that take what I would call rather extreme positions on privacy. Anybody that's been in a tech support role like mine has certainly encountered people that are either absolutist about not trusting anybody with their information, and therefore they don't take advantage of a lot of what the internet has to offer. Or we have the other end of the spectrum that, yep, they're still not very trusting, but it's out of a sense of paranoia. Everybody's out to get them. Both of these folks, along with the folks who just don't care about their privacy, are people that I hear from a fair amount. What I want to talk about is a more pragmatic approach to privacy. In other words, striking that balance and understanding where the real risks are, taking control over what we can take control over, and knowing what decisions to make for the things we can't. I want to start by defining two different kinds of privacy. One I'll call implicit privacy. That's the privacy we assume when we use an online service. Now, granted, the assumption may be a detailed reading of the terms of service for that service, but of course, we rarely do that. But even if we did, we're still assuming that the service is following what it has said, that it is in fact using the information we give to it in a way that is consistent with what they've said they'll do. We also assume that they're hiring upstanding individuals to run the service and that somebody in the back office isn't going to make off with the information they have access to. The other kind of privacy, however, is something that we have a little bit more control over, and that's what I refer to as explicit privacy. In other words, it's the choices you and I make when we post things online or when we send information to just about anybody. Choosing to post a photo publicly is kind of that sense of explicit privacy we are choosing not to use. We are also choosing this kind of explicit privacy when we decline to provide certain information to certain services or to certain individuals. The important thing about explicit privacy is that it is explicitly under our control. Now, any service we use is going to track us to some degree. That's the nature of the internet. Even when you visit a site like Askleo, I get things like your IP address. Now, I tend not to care about any of that information. In fact, I rarely ever look at it at that level of detail. But the same is true for any website or online service that you use. There is a certain amount of information that, just by the nature of how the internet works, they get and they could ignore or they could use to perform some kind of tracking. In addition, all of the services on which you have, I'll just say, accounts, or which you do any additional kind of interaction, well, they can track that too. If it's a service you buy from, of course, they're going to track your purchases. If it's a service that you simply comment on, well, they've got the ability at any rate to track your comments. Again, this is all, in a way, a side effect of how this technology works. Whether or not the businesses use this information or whether or not they use it to the degree we are so afraid of is actually up for debate. A lot of people are very concerned that all the websites are tracking them to a degree that, to be honest, just isn't real, just isn't realistic. You and I are not being tracked as we shop from store to store at the individual level. They may or may not know who you are, but they pretty much won't care. The important thing to take away from all this, though, is that Big Brother may not be watching. In fact, my sense is that he probably isn't. But the technology is in place should he want to. Now, you and I are responsible for a lot of the information that makes its way out, a lot of the stuff that, I'll just say, violates what we would consider to be our own personal sense of privacy. We make poor choices. I've often heard, for example, from people who have shared an important password with a friend, only to sometime later discover that that friend isn't their friend anymore. or their spouse isn't their spouse anymore, and they are now using that password for things that really weren't intended. We've all heard stories of people losing jobs or losing out on opportunities because, as part of, say, a company's background check, they discover that, 5, 10 years ago, they posted a bunch of pictures of them in some kind of a drunken party. And that reflected poorly on them, even though it was 10 years ago. The problem, of course, is that we may make an argument that that shouldn't matter because it was that long ago. But on the other hand, we can't guarantee that the companies we might be interviewing for, or that the people that are running across that information at any time in the future, might not take it more seriously than it was actually intended. That means that, of course, we are the ones that have violated our own privacy simply by choosing what to share publicly and what not to share publicly. We make poor decisions. It's common. It happens a lot. As I've said before, companies aren't really interested in tracking you as an individual. As I say often, and I have said in many places, you and I are just not that interesting. What is interesting are the masses. In other words, 100 people like me. Okay, that's something that a business might want to act on. But just me, just Leo Notenboom, they don't care. They really don't care. Even though it looks kind of like they do, because, as we've all experienced, you search for something and then all of a sudden you see ads for that something. Yeah, it's kind of tracking you, but in reality, it's not tracking you as an individual. It's tracking anybody who looked for that something and is then showing them those ads as well. I keep coming back to this over and over and over again. What looks like a specific invasion of your personal privacy is really nothing more than companies using massive amounts of data to track people like us, to do things that present information to people like us in order to engage us with their products and services. It can be spooky. It's not about you. It's about the thousands and thousands of people that behave online kind of sort of like you do. Now, I've often said that you and I aren't that interesting as individuals, but it could happen. Someday you might be interesting. Now, there are a couple of different cases where this comes up. I've talked about one of them already, and I just lump that into what I'll call future opportunities. Remember that anybody who intends to, I'll just say, evaluate you for anything, be it a job, a relationship, anything, they have access to all of the information that is publicly available about you. Whether or not they use it, we don't know, but it's out there. And it's the kind of a thing that we obviously hear stories about from time to time. People who are denied jobs because of something that came up in a publicly accessible background check. The other scenario, though, is a little bit more interesting and a little bit more problematic. It's law enforcement. Now, of course, depending on where you live, this can be very, very different. If you live in an oppressive regime, for example, what you need to keep private is significantly different than folks who might live in a less oppressive, less regimented regime. But even then, if you ever run afoul of law enforcement, all of the information you've posted publicly is immediately available to them, and potentially a lot of information that isn't public. A lot of information may require things like court orders, but it's all out there and it's all available. So if you are someone who regularly runs afoul of the law, this too is something you need to be very cognizant of and pay close attention to. So it's all very scary. It sounds all very complicated. I mean, it seems like you can't make much of a move online without leaving a trace. And in a sense, that's kind of true. But what I keep coming back to is that at a very pragmatic level, you and I, as individuals, as long as we're relatively well-behaved citizens, aren't going to be that interesting as individuals to anybody. Yes, a lot of data might get collected about us, but it's not going to be used to target us as individuals. It's going to be used to analyze lots and lots of people who behave the way we behave, so that perhaps they can be shown the products that they might be interested in, and we might be shown the products or whatever that we might be interested in. The most important thing to take away when it comes to your privacy is every time you post something publicly, be it on social media or even email or discussion groups or whatever, that's a little bit of your privacy kind of going away. It's not a bad thing. I mean, these conversations, this communication, these public forums are awesome, and they enable an immense amount of collaboration and interaction and forward progress. But it does mean that we need to be very careful and think before we hit send and before we hit post. That's the pragmatic reality. Most of what we care about comes back on us and our decisions. And indeed, if you don't trust the big companies, then don't use their services. That too is a decision that you have in your control. As I say at the end of this article, I remain a strong believer in our wonderfully interconnected world and all of the opportunities that it presents. Naturally, it brings risk as well as reward. Ultimately, it's our responsibility to be aware of those risks and make educated choices about the information we share with anyone. I hope this was interesting. I hope this spurs a little bit of thought into how you are or are not keeping the information you care about private. For related links, for any updates, and of course for comments and the conversation that is sure to follow, visit askleo.com/22674. I'm Leo Notenboom. This is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.